Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoi video. Ryan here with a new addition to our list building concept series, beginning with part 1 of a new video covering allies and coalition. If you may remember, the previous video in this series, the first actually, was not only my coverage of the knapsack spam concept for maximizing a particular set of things you want in your army, say a certain battle line unit or a certain big monster or whatever, seeing how many you could possibly fit in with all the restrictions that we have in list building, for example, having a general and 3 battle line and so forth. But in addition to that, in that video, we began by covering what the possible future is of this series, this list building series, where we have both niche and more general topics. That knapsack spam was definitely a more niche thing that not everyone's going to want to use to help them see what's possible in a list and then pull back from there. That's not everyone's way of building lists, and especially considering it takes a bit of time before you probably get to the most competitive version of a list. But allies and coalition kind of sit somewhere between being super normal and everyday for certain lists, even competitive lists, and then also being super niche. For example, if you're trying to absolutely maximize the amount of non-synergistic allies and coalition you can get in a list by raising your drops, that's not necessarily going to be on everyone's radar, but it certainly, as a Cities player, has been on mine for the past few years. That said, we don't know what's going to happen with Cities moving forward, but fortunately, this concept also applies very well to the Chaos God armies, so the 4 main gods, and in certain other order factions as well, for not only allies, but sometimes coalition. Unfortunately, death and destruction are kind of lacking in that department, but we'll get there later in the video. Before I forget though, feel free to like, subscribe, share the video. Everything you do helps boost the signal for this channel. And of course, join us in the Discord if you feel like commenting, and below in the comment section. Alright, so I've split this video into 2 parts. Originally, I actually recorded it as 1 part, but I've split it into 2 because I realized with the GHB coming out that not only are the missions and everything changing, but most likely the points are changing as well. And the second half of the video has what functionally will be outdated points values for my example list, as you see at the end there, and so forth. So anyway, I figured, you know what, I'll just scrap that second half and re-record it, or at least the parts that involve points, which would be the cheap units and example list part, and just let you guys have the first half for now, which cuts the runtime of the video down as well, so that's nice. So as a symbol here, I've got the Cities of Sigmar symbol, which is for the new book, the Dawnbringer inspired book. And for those that don't know, Cities originally came out with 7 cities in the book and then added 4 through the Broken Realms process, which is 11 and is exactly how many shields we see here surrounding that main shield. But and though people have done some analysis of which shields are which here, it's not 100% clear what's going to survive and whether they're going to end up still being as coalition, especially, or ally friendly as they have been in the past. For example, cities like Living City that can take not only the normal standard Stormcast units that we see in cities, but can also take Sylvaneth as coalition. We don't know if that's going to survive into the next edition. So, or the next book, I should say, and the next edition, sure. So anyway, seeing as Cities is kind of the home for coalition and allies of all armies out there, I figured we'd use that symbol above others, but clearly this applies to plenty of other armies too, this idea of allies especially. So what we're going to be covering in part 1 is the first 3 topics here, so that'll be defining what allies and coalition actually are, and then the benefits of using coalition and allies, and then a matrix for all 4 grand alliances that covers which armies can take which other armies as either coalition or allies. Simple enough. In the following video, we'll be looking at how 1 to 4 relationships work, what the cheapest units are in given armies for spamming purposes to help raise your drops to hit those 1 to 4s, and then an example list in Tempest for people that would like to see how one might approach building such a list given all the drops restraints and everything that you might try to squeeze in to get some cool synergies out. All right, so what is the concept of having allies or coalition in your army? So for some of you, this is going to be just obvious, but for those of you who are just kind of learning about this side of the game, I'm going to go through the details here. In short, allies may be a max of 20% of your points that you're using in the game. We most often use 2,000 points, so that would be 400 points worth of allies cumulatively. It doesn't matter which armies they come from, you just add them all together, and they can't go above 400. But if you were playing a 1,000-point game, it would be 200, of course. It's also got a restriction of max 1 allied unit for every 4 total units in your army. Now, this is a confusing ratio to a lot of people because a lot of times this makes you think 1 allied unit to 4 units of non-allies, like in the original faction. Say you're in Stormcast and you're taking some Ideneth allies. You'd be thinking, well, I can take 1 Ideneth unit for every 4 Stormcast units. That's not how that works. It's 1 for every 4, including the allied unit you just took. But we'll get into that more later. Your allies can't be given enhancements, so no command traits, which kind of is obvious from the next point that they can't fulfill general and battle line roles. But furthermore, on enhancements, they can't take command traits, artifacts, or even spell lores, including those from the universal spell lores, like taking, why am I blanking on this? Taking Flaming Weapon, or Ghost Mist, or Levitate, or like one of the prayers, like Curse. So if you ally in a priest, they can't be given an extra prayer that they don't know. So, for example, if you ally in the Soul Scryer from Ideneth, who is a priest but doesn't have a prayer of his own on his war scroll, then you're basically just stuck with Bless and Smite, which are the 2 generic ones. Anyway, and then furthermore, they can't fulfill, like I said before, general or battle line roles, meaning your general has to come from your army, and even though your allies still retain the battle line keyword or battlefield role for being able to be reinforced, or they qualify as battle line for, say, if a given battle tactic or something says if you kill a battle line unit, that would still count. They don't fulfill your minimum requirements for battle line, so in a 2,000 point game you need 3 of those. Taking those allies doesn't fulfill that at all. There was a point where Coalition used to let you do this, but it doesn't either anymore, as you'll see on the right-hand column. That said, they do still count as battle line for reinforcing, so you can, in fact, double reinforce, double reinforce, so it's triple the size, an ally unit that has the battle line battlefield role. But they do take up your leader, behemoth, and artillery slots, so it's not like if you took an allied leader and you already had 6 leaders in your list in a 2,000 point game, you can't do that. You'd have to get rid of one of your regular army leaders in order to make room for them. Same with the cap of 4 on behemoths or artillery. And then where do we find who your allies are? Well, these are the armies that are found in the pitch battle profiles at the last page of all the battle tomes. At the very bottom, it'll list all of your potential allies options, possibly with some restrictions. Now let's take a look at the coalition options, and I've matched the points side to side here with those of the allies, so you can see what's different between allies and coalition. So whereas allies had a maximum points restriction on what you could take, coalition does not. You can take as many points of coalition things as long as all the other conditions hold, including that you have a general from the original faction and 3 battle line units from that faction. But they do still have the max 1 in 4 total units in the army. They are eligible to be given enhancements, unlike allies. So if you have a coalition priest that you can bring in. That priest can, in fact, learn Curse. Of course, they can't be given enhancements that they are not eligible for, so ones that are keyworded, like usually the spell lores in a given army's book say the keyworded, let's say, Slaves to Darkness casters or whatever, wizards. So they usually can't be given those, but they could be given at least the universal ones, which is nice. They, just like allies, they can't fulfill general and battle line roles, and they do take up leader behemoth artillery roles. So that's nothing different there. Now, where do we find whether you're coalition or not, whether you have access to coalition? Well, this is harder. Usually this is found in the battle traits. For example, Stormcast in the Stormkeep has a way to take cities of Sigmar if you go that way, and that's at a 1 to 4 coalition. Or obviously Cities has it, a Stormcast in general, or at least at this moment it does, and then Coalition for specific armies based off of what city you're in. And then there are other things. The Chaos Gods have Coalition with certain things and so forth. These would all be found in the battle traits. Sometimes, at least you used to see this in sub-factions. For example, Bark, Thrying, and KO used to allow you to take Dwarden units as coalition, but that's been removed. So depending on how you define battle traits, if they ever do that again with a sub-faction, which I don't think currently exists in any of the 3rd edition books, if they ever do that again, then it depends on how you define battle traits, whether sub-factions are battle traits or not. But just so you know, it might not be found on those first 2 pages that are called the battle traits pages. Okay. One last point is we're excluding for today the following things that basically are allies, or I don't know if they're ever coalition, but definitely allies, would be Regiments of Renown, which is a new concept, and we'll have to cover that more later. I'll probably wait until after all of the Dawnbringer books come out so that we can better see what all of the Regiments of Renown that are available are instead of just the initial ones that have come out. So we'll save that for later. Mega Gargants, the big guys from Suns, there's a order-specific one, chaos-specific one, death-specific one, and then Destruction has access to all 3 of those. So in a sense, Mega Gargants do have allies. They can be allied in, but they work differently because they're like mercenaries and whatever. So we're going to exclude that for now. And then in order, you've also got Gotrek, Gertison, and Elanian Elithor. Obviously, what I'm not mentioning here are the units, the big god characters that exist, say, like Nagash in Death or Kragnos in Destruction, which can be used in all of the armies because they all appear in those books and feel like they belong, and they're listed on their pitch battle profile. So that's not really an ally or a coalition per se. So I could have written them here too, but they're kind of already in the army, which is why I didn't. All right, now that we know what this is all about, let's move on to looking at this more deeply. So why would we want to take allies or coalition in the first place? Well, the most obvious reason is to fill a role that's missing in your army. Say you have an army that has like no shooting, and one of your allies has some pretty decent shooting, and you want to complement it that way, there you go. Or better screens, or better shields, or more bodies because your army's super elite and you need just more bodies on the field. Or more flying units. There are tons of reasons why you would do this, which could be a video unto itself. And we've already covered in some of our Strategoi content with looking at Ideneth allies for Stormcast, which was a video from a while ago, and then looking at allies in general for Stormcast, which is a more recent video, which of course also hits on Ideneth as well. It used to be that Ideneth was the only ally that Lumineth could take, so at the time when we made that video, that was the obvious choice. So if you want to see some more about filling a role that's missing in your army, especially from a Lumineth perspective, go ahead and check that out. So in a kind of contrary way, you could also use allies or coalition to complement what your army already does well, especially if they can receive your buffs. So you might say, well, what do you mean receive your buffs? I thought you just said enhancements and stuff are usually faction keyworded and all that. That is true, but even while that was true for a lot of armies, Cities was very, and still is, very generous at giving out all their coalition units, not only the city's keywords, but also the keyword of the city. So cities of Sigmar and then, say, Tempesti would get added to their war scroll functionally, meaning that they got to benefit from all the command traits and enhancements that say cities of Sigmar or Tempesti or whatever on them, which is pretty awesome. And is one of the things I'm really scared they're going to take away when the new Cities book comes out. But it is what it is. Yeah, this is complementing what your army already does well. So if you're trying to get a different kind of tanky, or you just want to have something that has different attributes, it still is tanky, but it has, say, some kind of like debuff element that's really nice for your army. That could be a reason to do that. Or if I'm thinking about Tzeentch in Eternal Conflag, it's not a bad idea to take Sinessa, the Slaanesh ally, one of the big two flying ones, the named characters, because she's a caster that can cast from anywhere, her main spell from anywhere on the board. And of course, spell casting is great in Tzeentch because you're still getting fate points. It doesn't matter whether it comes from a Tzeentch unit or not. And her spell targets this unit and then gives you buffs to attacking that unit. I forget exactly what the buff is. It's like +1 to hit and wound or something like that. But which is pretty great for, say, Eternal Conflag list of shooters. You just kind of, what do we call that? Like laser sight or whatever, the target, and then light them up. Marker light, I think is what it is in 40k maybe. So anyway, kind of interesting. And so Tzeentch just doesn't have something like that kind of works exactly like that. It has other ways to buff your units, but that's kind of a nice way that feels very Tzeentchy, even though it's coming from a different army. Okay, third point. Allies and coalitions sometimes have abilities affecting friendly units or that debuff enemy units neutrally. So this is kind of what I was getting onto there. Friendly is one of those keywords I'm always, or not keywords, but words I'm looking for in rules text that's just really positive. Like it really kind of like sends up a red or a green light for me of, oh, keep in mind that this could be a good ally option. So, for example, as Siegfried was talking about in our allies video with the Drakesworn Templar, he gives a bubble of +1 to cast and -1 to unbind. -1 to unbind for enemy units and +1 to cast for friendly casters. So that's really great to have in Lumineth if you can't bring Teclis along. So that's the kind of thing that really I'm looking out for when I'm looking at my allies and coalition options. And then the next three are more maybe specific kind of things having to do with how you want to build your army and what your priorities are. So let's say you want to slowly build up another army by like taking an ally or coalition to a tournament. You paint that one model up, it's ready to go, and then you can take a different unit from that army. So this is how I built my Stormcast army, actually. It was because I was using them as coalition in cities, and it eventually just turned into like a 5,000 point painted Stormcast army just because I brought so many different units to tournaments with cities, which is pretty awesome. And then by that time, you're ready to play just Stormcast. So it's kind of a neat way to look at building a collection, and it's certainly one of the reasons why GW allows for allies and coalition, even though they've been pulling back on it in 3rd edition a bit and trying to de-soupify the game, as we say. Especially looking at you, a Legion of the First Prince, which is very much a bummer for certain people, myself included. I think I would have liked to have played it while those rules still existed. But GW does still keep these rules in there, I think, partly to encourage people's kind of like, addiction to model purchasing and slowly getting into another army. It kind of gives you a excuse to get into something else. And I can say it's a very big reason why I ended up collecting the armies I have. Maybe a historical video on my giant collection that I've amassed over only 2 years or so. Let's call it 3. Maybe that's due for a video at some point for those that are interested in that kind of thing. The next point, you want a specific army type, let's say all flying, but your range is too small. For example, Stormcast can make an all flying list. I'm very fond of all flying armies, which is one of the reasons I chose Ideneth as my first army. So what do you need to have an all flying army? You need to have a general that flies. You need to have battle line or conditional battle line that can get turned on by that general or a sub faction. Turned on, that also flies, because you have to have 3 battle line units in a 2,000 point game, right? And then outside of that, you could take whatever else your army has that flies, but if that doesn't have a lot of options, then you go to allies and coalition. So Stormcast, you can take like a Knight Draconis, or in fact, you can take Krondys or Karazai as your general, and then you end up unlocking Stormdrake Guard as battle line. Or you could be in, I forget the sub-faction's name off the top of my head, but it's the one that unlocks prosecutors as battle line, the flying angel guys. Or you could do both. You could have your general be a Knight Draconis, have Stormdrake Guard, have prosecutors, and you can make an all-flying Stormcast list that's actually not bad, but if you want some more units, like not just heroes that are flying, you're really looking at just either wings, the 2 types of prosecutors, and then Stormdrake Guard. That's really all that you've got that flies in the non-heroes section of Stormcast. So then you're looking to the wide plethora of all the armies except Daughters, which we'll get into, that Stormcast has access to as either coalition in the case of cities, or allies that have flying units. And that opens up a wide plethora of extra options if you're interested in that. And then finally, rule of cool. You just think that it's cool to have allies or coalition in your army, even if you know it's not efficient or competitive. All right, so I think we've made a good enough case for why you might want to take allies or coalition. Let's move on to more details. So I'm going to break down a matrix for all of the factions, going down from the one with the most allies and coalition options, and therefore the most complicated, which would be Order, to Grand Alliance, Chaos with a kind of moderate amount, to then Death and Destruction, which kind of get the short end of the stick here when it comes to allies and coalition options. I don't know why GW did it this way. It would be nice if they opened it up a bit more, but it's a little bit more flexible than what it looks like on the surface, but we'll get into it when we get there. So as you can see, on each of the rows there is going to be the army that you're taking, and then each of the columns is going to be the ally or coalition army, here notated as A or C, that you do or don't have access to. If you don't have access to, I didn't write anything in the chart. If you do, I wrote A or C, or both, and sometimes with modifiers. And if it's your own army, I just put a dash, because obviously you can't take your own army as allies or coalition. You're already your own army. All right, so cities. I don't need to read all of these out. I'll just kind of like make some comments about some maybe not obvious things. Cities has a wide range of ally options, and so like Fire Slayers is a normal ally, IDK is a normal ally for them. They also have 2 armies that are only listed as coalition, and for different reasons. Stormcast is the generic always coalition, like evergreen coalition in cities, because the cities of Sigmar are protected like with a storm keep, literally a giant fortress that has a different chapter of Stormcast living there, protecting the city. They're basically citizens of the city. They're kind of like the military. If you want to look at like the Free Guild and all that stuff as being more like civilian corps, the Stormcast is kind of like the overarching federal military, if you want to think of it that way. The big guns. So they're just always coalition, and that's actually better. You would rather see coalition on this chart, just C by itself, than AC. But of course that depends on what AC means here. So for example, let's look at, we'll be talking about this more later. For KO, I've got AC, which means they're allies or coalition. They are allies most of the time, which is why I wrote allies first. So in all cities but Tempesai, they're just allies. And they follow the allies rules. So they're stuck to 400 points max and all the other rules. Can't be given keywords and stuff. But in Tempest, they're coalition, which means that you've got essentially in Tempest, KO and Stormcast as coalition options at the same time, which is pretty great. The other ones are Daughters and Harkoran, but Harkoran's weird because it kind of takes away a lot of your cities units. It's like an anti-ally in the sense that it reduces the amount of units you can take. You can basically only take Dark Elf stuff. And you lose some of the other cities' benefits, which is kind of weird. Who knows what's going to happen with Harkoran in the future because it's had a long, weird history, and the relationship between Stormcast and Daughters is weird too. And then we've got... furthermore, Sylvaneth that also acts as KO. I didn't cover what Lumineth's all about, though. Sylvaneth, by the way, is in Living City. Lumineth, they added in Broken Realms a city called Settler's Gain, which allows you to take Lumineth as coalition in the same way that any of the other coalition options here that aren't Stormcast can be taken. The difference with Stormcast version, though, here, I could have done C light or C minus, is that it's only in one city, whereas the Stormcast one is coalition in every single city except Harkoran, but that's an exception. So anyway, that's what's going on with cities. You'll notice they can't take Seraphon. Looking at Doc, we're looking at cities and then basically elves. So you've got IDK, Lumineth, and Sylvaneth, and then they added Stormcast back in, which is kind of nice because of the whole Harkoran Marathi, Broken Realms Marathi thing that kind of soured the water a bit. Interesting that they can take, sometimes when it says you can take city, they've been pulling back on this too, but sometimes when they say you can take cities, they would say only specific types of units, because in cities, if you don't know, is either human, elf, or dwarf for the most part, and sometimes they used to split those up. So like KO still to this day can only take cities that are Dwarden, so dwarves, which is why under KO for cities it's got allies minus, which means that it's got the it's less than just full armies worth of allies. But I'll come back to the star in a minute. So Doc, though, lets you take anything from cities, including humans or dwarves, because it's just regular allies. Fire Slayers, you'll see that there's only 3. There's cities, and then there's KO, and then there's Stormcast. Now, next to KO and cities, I put an asterisk there to indicate that Fire Slayers, for certain Dwarden units, if you take the right command trait, those units can benefit from your sub-faction, or from your runes, your battle traits, just the runes themselves, which actually makes Fire Slayers the best home for a soup dwarf army in a sense, and definitely the best home for Gotrek, because he gets to use those runes, which can really buff him up. Okay, IDK, it's basically the same as Daughters in the sense that it's all elves, and they've got Lumineth in there, which is interesting, because that's interesting because they used to not, because they were kicked out of, or like genocided, or at least attempted genocide by Teclis. So that's kind of strange, but that's been patched up evidently in the meantime. And then I said everything is just elves, but it's also Stormcast. As you'll see, every single army has some version of access to Stormcast. Cities having coalition, of course. All right, KO also has cities, Fire Slayers, and Stormcast, the complement to what Fire Slayers has. The difference here is that they're not giving buffs to their battle trait to dwarves, but if you take a sub-faction, so Bark Thrying, and you take priests, Dwarden priests, they can use an extra prayer, which I actually don't think is worth it, but some people are definitely trying to build an army around it to see if it works, mostly for more casual games. Lumineth has access to the elves just like anyone else does. Is there a notable exception here? I guess not having access to cities is kind of weird, especially considering cities has access to Lumineth in a way with Settler's Gain. But who knows what's going to happen when the new cities book comes out. All right. Seraphon. Seraphon has access to cities, which might be a new edition. I can't remember from the old book. And Stormcast. They don't have access to anything else. Stormcast has access to everything but Doc, which is kind of weird because it works the other way around, which is definitely a holdover from that whole Broken Realm stuff, but keep in mind the Cities book came out as one of the 2 first books for 3rd edition with Orc War Clans, and it was pretty fresh off the heels off of all that, so maybe at the time they thought it made sense not to include it, but maybe if they get a new book, they'll throw Doc back in. And then, like I mentioned before, if you're in the kind of half faction that's called Stormkeep instead of Scions of the Storm, you can use cities as coalition, and they get some amount of buff traits that you can use, which is kind of cool. I didn't mark that in there. And then Sylvaneth, strangely, even though the Doc likes having Sylvaneth, Sylvaneth doesn't like having Doc. And also interestingly, Sylvaneth also doesn't like Lumineth, which liked them back. And they do like Fire Slayers. This comes from, it's sort of a nod to what Ironbark used to be. I think Ironbark might have also had any Dwarden in it, or at least KO maybe, I can't remember, but definitely, maybe it was Cities Dwarden and Fire Slayers. But anyway, that's kind of a nod to that, but now it's not subfaction locked anymore, it's just there. So in summary, the army that has the most allies or coalition options is a kind of a tie, depending on how you look at it, with Stormcast that has 7 allies plus 1 coalition as cities some of the time, or Cities, which has 5 allies options, so less, I guess, but they have 5 coalition options, which have unlimited points. So in a sense, I would say Cities definitely wins this, but it depends on how you look at it. The army that has the least is definitely Seraphon, which only has 2 allies and no coalition. The most, and then the other way of looking at it is the army that's most available as an ally or coalition is Stormcast, which is all the armies, 7 plus 1, it's coalition, and then the rest of the armies, it's ally. And then the least available as ally or coalition is Seraphon, which is only accessible as an ally for Stormcast. But that lets you bring that Slann, and that can be pretty fun. All right, let's move on to Chaos. This will go a little faster. I might actually cover this in 2 different ways. So even though I did them in alphabetical order, so we got Beasts of Chaos, Blades of Khorne, Disciples of Tzeentch, Hedonites of Slaanesh, Magickin, Nurgle, Skaven, and Slaves to Darkness, if you don't know what those kind of 3-letter acronyms are, kind of abbreviations. The 4 Chaos God armies, so Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, and Nurgle, function differently than the other 3, so I'm going to take a look at the other 3 first. Let's start with Beasts of Chaos. They can only take Slaves to Darkness as allies, and that's it. So there you go. I'm skipping down to Skaven. Skaven can only take Magickin of Nurgle as an ally, and only if their general is Clan Pestilence. But that's pretty easy to do. Just make it means you're giving up a command trait you might want to give to someone else, and you have to take like a Plague Priest or something. But it's actually not that bad. And then you can take some Nurgle stuff, which is pretty fun. And you can make a kind of a soup Nurgle army, which is also neat. You can also do that in reverse the other way too. But we'll get to that in a sec. And then Slaves to Darkness is kind of like the Cities or Stormcast, if you want to look at it that way, of Chaos, in the sense that it's kind of all the normal people, and it's kind of like also the Stormcastiest. And they can take a lot of allies. So they can take everyone but Skaven, and of course themselves, but everyone but Skaven. Okay, so the way the Chaos books work, the Chaos Gods books, is they have a certain number of access to other Chaos Gods based off of which feuds they have. So, for example, Khorne is okay with Nurgle, but doesn't like Tzeentch because he's magic, or Slaanesh because also kind of magic. And Tzeentch is cool with Slaanesh for similar reasons, but not friendly with Nurgle or Khorne. So that's kind of what you see there. It's not even the whole way down, as you'll see. Slaanesh and Nurgle both have 2 gods that they're chiller with than the other ones are, but when you flip it around, it's not necessarily the other way. So Slaanesh and Nurgle are a little friendlier, and then Khorne and Tzeentch are a little pickier. But in any case, that's what you get with the pure allies. And then what we see is that all 4 of them can take Beasts of Chaos as coalition in the normal 1-to-4 ratio. So with a couple exceptions, like the only ones was no one can take the Tzeentch marked ones, because in Tzeentch you already have access to those units, and they want you to take the Tzeentch versions of them that sometimes are different points. And then in the other armies, well, they're not taking Tzeentch units. But for the most part, it's just you have access to the whole Beast of Chaos, which is better than what it used to be. It used to be locked up in a battalion in 2nd edition, even before all the new books came out. 3rd edition kind of totally changed it. And then all 4 of the Chaos Gods can take Slaves to Darkness as coalition if they have the Mark of Chaos keyword and it's specific to their keyword, like Khorne or Tzeentch. Like Tzeentch can take as coalition Mutilith Vortex Beasts now, which is great. So you can take unlimited of those, or at least up to 4 because they're behemoths, if you really want to. That's probably not optimal, but definitely fun. So you can take them, and here's kind of the exception, is if they're Mark of Chaos appropriate and don't have any of the other keywords you're not supposed to have, depending on the army, then you can take them in a ratio of 2 to 4 instead of 1 to 4, which we'll talk about later. And then the allies minus there is basically the rest of the army that doesn't apply, minus the same keyword. So this basically gives you access to the undivided units, like cultists, if you want to take them. The cultists that don't have a keyword. I don't think there might be a cultist that has a keyword, but I don't. That's not undivided, but I don't think so. So that's kind of how that works. It gets a little complicated. So, and then Nurgle goes one step further and has Skaven as a coalition, so long as it's coming from Clan Pestilence, which is why I said C- here, is that it's not the whole Skaven range, it's just Clan Pestilence. But they're coalition, which basically means you can take unlimited points. I don't think they benefit from any of the battle traits inside Nurgle, unlike how Cities does, but it's still cool nonetheless. So looking down below, the army that has the most allies or coalition is either Slaves with 5 allies but no coalition, or Nurgle, which I've counted like minuses as 0.5s. So they've got 2.5 allies, if you want to say that, in the form of Blades of Khorne, Slaanesh, and then the remainder of Slaves that isn't Mark of Chaos. And then 2.5 coalition, which would be Beast, Slaves, and then Skaven. You could argue that those coalition, by the way, that the Slaves to Darkness coalition should be minus as well, because it's not the whole range. It's just the Mark of Chaos stuff. So maybe I should have put that in there. And then the armies that have the least allies or coalition are definitely Beast and Skaven, each tied for 1, where Beast has Slaves and Skaven has Nurgle. And you could argue that Skaven's even has less access because you have to take a specific general, Pestilence general, to make that happen. And then the most available as an ally or coalition would be Slaves. With I've counted half points up here as 3, because there was 1 pure ally and then 4 halves. But you could say that it's 4 like Mark of Chaos. Or non-Mark of Chaos allies plus 1 full ally. And then you could have also said the same thing about Seas, which still puts them at the most. Or I guess you could argue that Beasts of Chaos would be the most because they don't have a restriction. So maybe I should have put that in there too, now that I'm thinking about it. But you get the idea. And then the least available ally or coalition is definitely Skaven, which is not allyable for anyone and is only coalitionable for the Pestilence units for Nurgle. Okay, let's move on. We can go through the next bit even faster. Maybe I didn't actually go that fast on the Chaos stuff. But Death and Destruction is much simpler, as you can see on the chart. So, as you know, Death and Destruction only have 4 books apiece, and since Allies and Coalition are basically not assigned individually to Cruel Boys and Bone Splitters and Ironjaws, I'm just lumping them all in as Auric War Clans, OWC. So it's only 4 armies in Destruction, and Big Waz has no exceptions to that either. And I'm not counting each of those sub-factions as like allies to each other because they don't interact that way. That's just what Big Waz is for, really. So, Death. We've got Feck, Nighthaunt, OBR, and Soulblight. And what you're seeing here is that Feck and Nighthaunt can take Soulblight as allies and nothing else. OBR can neither take anything nor be an ally or coalition to anyone. And you'll see that there's no coalition in the Death chart at all. And then Soulblight can take Feck and Nighthaunt. So, pretty abysmal here. Like the flexibility. I mean, it's pretty obvious who has the most and least, so you can just look at the chart below if it's not obvious. But Soulblight and OBR are kind of the extremes there. Yeah, it's kind of a bummer that there isn't more crossover here. Maybe they'll expand Death to be able to do that more in the future. Obviously, the big thing that crosses over the most is Nagash himself, but you know, it is what it is. And then looking at destruction, we got Gits, Ogre Maw Tribes, Orc Warclans, and Sons of Behemoth. Now, this has got a big caveat next to it. So Gits can take Orc Warclans. Ogre Maw Tribes can take a very small subset of Gits. I think it's the Ale Guzzler Giant or Gargant, whatever, and Trogoth units that are kind of like Ogrely, I guess. And then Warclans can take Gits. But that's it. Except that technically the other three can each take Sons of Behemoth as that thing I said we're not going to talk about, which is any one of the three Mega Gargants that are named versions of the Gatebreaker and the Kraken Eater and the War Stompa. So they're in there, but it keeps you from taking any other allies. Now, that said, there's so many points that they would have eaten your allies' points anyway, even if, except if it were coalition. That's the only way that would have worked. But I'm just not including it because I said I was going to treat that separately, because then I'm not including it for the other factions, the other Grand Alliances that could be taking it. But so clearly here, Gits and War Clans have the most allies or coalition, and the least is Sons, which has access to nothing. And again, I'm not including Regents of Renown either. And then we've got the most available is Gits or Sons, if you want to count that, and the least available is Ogre Maw Tribes. No one can take Ogre Maw Tribes as ally, evidently. And of course, there's no coalition here either. So Death and Destruction, kind of getting the short stick here, but it is what it is. And there you have it. That's the end of part one, but we've got more content to come. And as you might have noticed here, part one was a bit more on the basic side, trying to cover the basics for obviously what allies and coalition are. And therefore, if you're already pretty familiar with that, maybe this video wasn't meant for you. But part two is definitely going to be more leaning in that direction, as we'll have more talk over how we actually squeeze all those units in the list building itself. So I hope you guys stick around for that video, which will be coming out once I get all of the points, once we see what all the points are going to be for the next 6 months or so, or however long they last. Fingers crossed. In the meantime, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Join the comments section below in the Discord, and we'll keep the conversation going. And until next time, Ryan out.